just like to thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you on behalf of the International Year of Light Steering Committee. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge my indebtedness to John Dudley, who is not only the chair of the International Steering Committee, but also was instrumental in steering the proposal for the International Year of Light through multiple layers of bureaucracy, culminating in the adoption by the United Nations at the end of last year. So in December, the General Assembly declared 2015 to be an International Year of Light with these three key themes: promoting education, providing technological solutions, and improving links between science and society. And I hope to touch on these three issues during my talk. So why 2015 and why it was important to get this declared as an International Year of Light last year? There are several anniversaries, perhaps plus or minus a year or two, depending on who you talk to, but it's 50 years since the discovery of the cosmic microwave background, 100 years since Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, 150 years since Maxwell's equations, 200 years since Fresnel's theory of diffraction, and approximately 1,000 years since Ibn al-Hazim's text on optics was published in the Arabian world. So 2015 was very important to be taken advantage of as an international year, because such a concatenation of anniversaries was not coming again for a long time. So the International Year of Light has only been possible thanks to the hard work of a lot of different partners. Of course, the professional societies got involved very early, but we've also had patronage from some large companies and medium-sized companies, small companies, etc. And all of these organisations have assisted in funding the operation of the International Year of Light Steering Committee. Interestingly, in the context of Ecoc, there is very little in the way of engagement from the companies in the optical communications area, and I think it's easy to understand why that is, but I'll come back to that later on. So the opening ceremony this year was in January. Ban Ki-moon addressed everybody who was there, and it was a ceremony which basically set the stage for all the things which have been happening since then. There are International Year of Light committees around the world. Every country has its own steering committee, is organising different events around the world. There are a number of themes which were identified at the time. We all know, of course, how important optics is in optical communications, but it's amazing just how many areas of light are impacted by either light or light-based technologies. The pictures you see here show how the system has been, how the International Year of Light is being celebrated in different countries. The top left is the fireworks display in Sydney, which is a really spectacular fireworks display, but that had the IYL logo on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This was a few minutes after the start of 2015 in Australia. The picture on the top right is the UNESCO headquarters at the opening, CERN headquarters, Amsterdam railway station, etc. So there's been a wide uptake, not just in the political sphere, but also in all sorts of spheres of life. And stamps and coins set commemorating the Year of Light have, of course, been produced in many countries, and there are more coming. Interestingly, in the context of Ecoc, only one of these stamps as David Payne identified on Monday, acknowledges or pays any attention to optical communications, and that's the UK stamp, which you see there in the middle on the left. There are a large number of international committees. I'm part of a New Zealand committee, but every country has its committee, which has the same logo, but of course has the International Year of Light in its own language. And this multiplicity of languages is very important, not just for the International Year of Light, but in promoting the adoption of broadband technologies around the world, which is one of the things I want to spend a bit of time talking about. The International Year of Light is inclusive and international. This picture shows access to the official website. The official website there, you'll see light2015.org. And this is, the color code is sort of a proportional to the number of hits in one day on this website. See, every country in the world is accessing that website with just two exceptions. One is North Korea, and the other is the Western Sahara. Now, in addition to the official endorsement by the committee, you do tend to come across references to the Year of Light in all sorts of places, which is always gratifying. I mean, we are promoting the adoption of the promotion of the International Year of Light wherever possible. So this is an in-flight magazine on the left, Girl Guides of Australia, in Campari, making reference to the International Year of Light. But we have been gratified by the amount of political uptake concerning the International Year of Light. And I think it's easy to understand why, but there are a series of pictures here. The one that is not perhaps self-explanatory is the one on the bottom right, which is a special session of the Korean Parliament to discuss the International Year of Light. The Sesame synchrotron in Jordan is a nice example of how the International Year of Light can promote cooperation between neighbouring countries. But it's easy to gain the attention of politicians, of course, when you're discussing photonics, because the market is not only large, but it is growing at a very significant rate, a rate much bigger than the growth rate of most economies. So there have been a number of publications talking about this, and this is an easy way to make the point when talking to politicians in different countries. But it's not just about money. We're all aware of the fact that climate change and sustainable development are becoming increasingly important, and more people are worrying about these. And this is where photonic technologies can make a tremendous contribution. Energy efficient buildings, low power consumption lighting can reduce the total power consumption. Of course, we're all concerned about carbon emissions. Rather than just reducing power, one has to worry about burning fossil fuels. And one of the interesting things which has been brought into the spotlight with the International Year of Light and focusing on photovoltaic technologies is that they are improving steadily. The PV technologies had their own doubling time. In the last 10 years, the number of watts per dollar you get from a photovoltaic system has doubled approximately every 2 years. What that means is that the cost of power generated from PV technologies will drop below that of fossil fuel-based power generation, probably around 2020. So this has huge implications, because it's all very well to say, don't burn fossil fuels because they're damaging the planet. It's much more effective to say, don't burn fossil fuels because there's a cheaper alternative. So again, from the political point of view, it's important to realize the difference in the different regions of the world. And on the right there, you can see the difference in these, if you like, the size of the pipes connecting different countries to the internet. Huge disparities between different communities. And 80% of the world's population lives in what are technically called developing countries. Developing countries are generally in these reports that one reads from the United Nations divided into developing and least developed countries. And the least developed countries, only 1 in 10 person has any access to the internet. And this has huge implications for healthcare amongst other things. And of course, sustainable development will only be made possible by the improvement in access to the internet. One of the things which not everybody is aware of is just a simple thing, that is that if you want to improve the education of children in the least developed countries, they need access to light after dark. And the only access in many countries is, say, kerosene-powered lamps, which are not only expensive, but they're also polluting. So the developments in PV technology and battery technology, which are generating low-cost light systems, are having a huge impact there. There was a photograph which went viral, as they say, recently, of a child in the Philippines taking advantage of the light of a McDonald's food shop to do homework. Of course, the millions of people who saw this photograph did not include either him or his family. Right? The other thing which is important that the photonic and optical technologies can bring you, of course, is almost forgotten, and that is that hundreds of millions of people don't have access to simple glasses. And if those of us here who do use glasses were to remove them or indeed their contact lenses and try and get through a day without them, you realize just what a difference that can make to the quality of your life. So I have here a picture, this one's courtesy of NASA, of where the world's people live in approximation. You can see there are big chunks where there aren't too many people, but they're also pretty widely scattered around the world. If you compare that with this picture, this is the satellite picture, composite satellite picture, looking at, if you like, spare light or street lighting. And you can see, if you like, where there is an effective electric grid. And then comparing those two with this one, this is the internet access. This is a diurnal variation. You can see that this is running over a 24-hour period. So if I take a point, say now, this is the middle of the night in Europe, and then morning, this is midday. So you can see that the internet access obviously has a daily variation, but there are still big chunks of the world where there are no dots at all. Nobody is getting connected. So what can we do about that? The most amazing thing is the growth of the mobile broadband subscriptions. And there's no doubt that this is a much more effective and lower cost way of getting internet access to as many people as possible. And once you have internet access, then you have all sorts of facilities. In particular, you can improve healthcare, you can improve education. There was a recent report which I'd like to draw your attention to from an organization called the Broadband Commission. This is a collaboration between UNESCO and ITU. It was just released a week ago in Geneva, and it is a snapshot of what is their best estimate of the state of broadband access in the world. And it identifies some interesting issues. By the end of this year, it's expected that there will be about as many mobile cell phones as there are people in the world. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that everybody's got a cell phone. It particularly does not mean that everybody is online. So 4.3 billion, or about 57%, still do not have access to the internet, and 90% of those people live in the developing world. But in a series of surveys, it's very clear that it's widely accepted that internet access should be a fundamental right on the same level as clean drinking water, for example. It's also clear that access to the internet is an essential prerequisite to economic development. So it's vital to address not only the issues which have had quite a bit of attention recently, that is redistribution of wealth between the super rich and the rest of us, but it's also, I think, important to address what's happening in the least developed countries at the other end of the spectrum. So these are the sort of key numbers which are important. On the left is the proportion of households with internet access broken down geographically, and on the right, a simpler 4 bars which compares the developed countries with the developing countries and what are called the least developed countries. In the least developed countries, only 6.7% of households have internet access. So what can be done about this? Part of the problem is the cost of supplying internet access when it's driven commercially, and if the commercial providers cannot see a return, then this will not happen. There are some creative solutions which are being discussed. These are Google's ideas for testing balloons and drones which stay aloft forever because they're driven by solar power to fly over sparsely populated areas providing internet access. There are even more extreme proposals. There are 2 or 3 companies now which are planning to launch satellites at a low cost. This one, Rocket Labs, is aiming at launching a satellite every week for under $5 million. And under $5 million is a step change because at the moment the cost of launching a satellite is well over $100 million. So if you could get a sufficient network of satellites up, then maybe one could provide access that way. Maybe one of these types of solutions will succeed, but really when you look at the growth of cellular broadband, it seems likely that the access, which can be provided fairly readily, can be done with cellular. It's a very interesting graph here of the growth of mobile broadband. It's the fastest growing ICT service in history. It's hard to read these graphs, but the big bar at the bottom is the number of years it took for fixed landlines to reach 1 billion people, 125 years. For people to use Google, 13 years. Facebook, 8 years. But mobile broadband subscriptions reached 1 billion people in just 5 years. So what that means is that for many consumers in developing markets, the first experience that they will have of access to the internet will be through a smartphone, whereas for most people in this room, I imagine, our first experience of the internet was actually on a computer. This is another interesting plot in this report, which talks about commercial viability, and this is really important because it's very hard to see how broadband will be distributed widely unless it's commercially viable. In other words, unless the companies have an incentive to do it. And the 3 technologies here, FTTH, FTTC, and LTE cellular systems, you can see that this analysis was done for one particular country, but broadly similar results can be expected for any country. FTTH is commercially viable for just over 20%, and that really reflects the density of housing in cities. FTTC, you might get up to 40% and still get a return on your investment, but it reflects the urban-rural divide where under 50% of the people lived in towns or cities. However, LTE systems can provide broadband access to 90% of the population at a commercially viable rate. So that indicates that these technologies are likely to be the ones which we should promote in order to access the least, provide access in the least developed countries. You can say, well, that's all cellular. What's that got to do with optical communications? Well, of course, if you do expand the LTE systems, then in order to provide a suitable bandwidth, you end up having to have an expansion of a fibre optic backbone. But the problem here is, how do you fund it? Another one of these acronyms that appears in this report is what's called LLDC. These are landlocked, least developed countries. It's much cheaper, of course, to provide access to a transoceanic cable than it is to lay fibre optic infrastructure over a big landmass. And so it may be that new approaches and quite different business models will be needed if we're going to actually achieve significant coverage in these least developed countries, with additional sources of fundings for HATs from grants from international institutions to build infrastructure, new types of public-private partnerships, etc. And it's in everybody's interest that these countries do get broadband access, because it's important that they develop their economies and want to live where they currently live and not go somewhere else. So I'd just like to encourage people to engage when the opportunity arises, because I'm always surprised at how few people in the general public realize just how important optics is. Photonic technologies, in particular, optical technologies, the number of people who don't realize that the internet would not exist without optical technologies never fails to surprise me. So in the International Year of Light, there's an unprecedented opportunity to engage in this way. It's all about education. If we want the least developed countries to develop, then the young people must have education. Access to education means access to light after dark, and it also means access to the internet. Of course, you could say they need to be able to charge their smartphones if they've got their smartphones, but the same technology which is going to provide light after dark will enable that. So, in closing, I'd like to say that it's a perfect opportunity now to make connections with people, because what the International Year of Light Steering Committee really wants is that there should be an enduring legacy from the Year of Light. We don't just want 1 year of celebration. We want there to be an enduring change which comes about from the International Year of Light, and there won't be another Year of Light in our lifetimes. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.